Welcome back to C# for Total Noobs on Developer Ramp-Up. In this lesson we'll talk about operators. This is not a very complicated topic, but it is very important for us to know exactly what operators do we have in C#, what operators are and how can we use them, because this allows us to add some logic to our applications further when we will also dive deeper into condition statements or loops and so on. Initially, I wanted to include in this lesson also condition statements like if and switch, but then I thought better and I think it's best to concentrate right now only on operators, so during the next lesson we will start to add some logic in our application with condition statements. Now let's get started with operators, and I am already in Visual Studio. If you are not in Visual Studio already, just launch the application and then choose from this recent list your My First App project that we have been working on since the beginning of this training. In few seconds this project should open and we would be able to continue working. Now this is exactly how we left the application the last time we talked about data types and variables. Let's do some cleaning up because right now we don't need all this information. So let's simply clean this up, and here instead of console write line number 2, which will give us an error right now because we do not have a variable called number 2, but let's just add a space here as a console write line. And when talking about operators, we will take into consideration different ways to categorize operators. I have to say that I will follow the official documentation of C# because I think it's best when we learn this language to follow that documentation. You will find on the internet a lot of ways to categorize operators, also in other programming languages, but also more common way that could still be applicable in most of the programming languages. But as said, I would prefer to stick to the official Microsoft documentation regarding C#. And the first type of operators that the Microsoft documentation lists are the so-called primary operators. Before we dive deeper into it, I have to say that we won't cover really all operators that are available in C# because it doesn't make sense. There are a lot of operators out there. What we'll cover in this lesson are the operators that are very common, that we use mostly every day when we write code. And the first category listed in the C# documentations are the so-called primary operators. And from this category, there is one operator that is really important. We have already used it, but we didn't know that it is an operator. For instance, when we want to do a console write line. So we write console, and if we then press dot, this dot is basically an operator, and it is called member access operator. What this does, you can see here that it lists basically all things that are available inside this console class. We'll talk later about classes, but the idea is that if you have something like a class or an object, anything, if you press the dot, this is a member access operator and you get access to all members of that specific class. And this operator is used really daily, even if you don't know exactly that this is an operator, but it is a very important one. And now that we also have this list, what this is called Intellisense in Visual Studio. And Intellisense is a tool built for developers to help us make the right choices. So when we write console and put this dot, press this dot here, Intellisense makes us some suggestions and shows us what we have available on this console class. And when you will design your own classes, when you press dot, it will show you anything that there is inside your own class and so on. So this is really, really important. Here, for instance, when we start to type, we see that we have a write method and a write line method. So we can choose simply this one. It's important here just to note that this dot here that we used after console, this is an operator and it is called a member access operator. And let's do another thing to get acquainted with Visual Studio. Let's also introduce comments. Comments are a way to add some information to our line of codes. Let's put here primary operators. And here we have first member access operator. What this means, so when we want to write comments in our code in Visual Studio, we have to use this // and as you see, the text that we write here is in green. What this actually means is that comments are only informational aspects about how this program is supposed to work, or about the variables that we need, and so on. It is really important to know that when we use these slashes, we basically indicate to the compiler that this text doesn't need to be compiled as code. So when our program will be compiled, when the compiler will reach our comment, it will simply skip it and then go to console write line here. So comments are very important to give some information regarding the code that you have written. And this might prove very useful also when other developers will work on the same projects that you worked on, because they might not know exactly what exactly you meant with a certain line of code, but if you comment it, you can explain them what you wanted to achieve there. Here we have then the member access operator, which is this dot, and let's put here // and dot as a member access operator. Then another operator, a primary operator, is the array indexer. And what this means is basically that this is an operator that allows us to access members of a certain array. And for this operator, we also will make a short demo. Let's define a string array. In the last video, we explained how to do this, but let's make this int array. It would be much easier. So it would be int array. Remember, using these square brackets after the data type indicates that what we will have here is an array. So these square brackets are really important in this aspect. Let's give a name. Let's name it numbers equals, and let's also initialize this array and put here some values, 1, 2, 3, okay, or 4. That's not a problem. It's not important what values we put there. And what we could do here, for instance, is console write line numbers, and then again the square brackets, and let's choose 0. What this code will do, it will simply access the element on the 0th position in this array. You have to know that arrays in C# and generally in computer science are always 0 indexed. So this means basically that the first element is on the index 0, the second element is on index 1, the third element is on index 2, and so on. And this is very important because when you want to access an element in an array, for instance, right now we wanted to access the first element in the array. So in this case, we just use these numbers, which is the name of the array, and we use once again these square brackets. In this case, these square brackets are the array indexer accessor. So what if you put here a number? This means that you specify the index of a specific element. In this case, we specify the element at index 0. So at index 0, the first element is 1. Right now, when we run our program, I would expect that we should get printed in the console the number 1, because we want to print only that specific element of the array, using these square brackets, which in this case are an array indexer operator. And this operator is really very, very important. You will use it almost every day, because almost every day you will work with arrays. Let's just wait a little bit until this program starts, and it should display, I would expect, the number 1, and then the console window should remain open until we close it. And indeed we have displayed this number 1. So array indexer operator, and this is these square brackets. And these are basically the primary operators that I want to focus on right now. These operators are used every day. All the other operators in this category are not that often used, and for now it doesn't make any sense to give a lot of information that you would seldom use. I would rather concentrate on things that are really important and that you would use almost every day. Let's then go to another category of operators in the C# documentation, and that category is the unary operators. Unary operators usually mean that they have only one operand, because we can have an operator that has two or more operands, but there is also this category of unary operators that have only one operand. And as an example here, we can give the incrementation. Here, for instance, let's define a variable int number equals 5, and let's define int x equals plus plus 5, or plus plus numbers, sorry. What does this mean? This means normally that what we have done here is that we have defined or declared a new variable of type integer, and when we wanted to assign a value to this integer, we just incremented with this plus plus sign, we incremented the value of the variable number, which was 5. So in this case, int x should be 6. Let's try this out in our program and let's see if that is really true. Okay, and let's run this program again. Okay, we have 6. So this worked correctly. It is important when we talk about this incrementation operator that we have two types of incrementation. It could be pre-incrementation, what we have used here, when we put this operator plus plus before the variable name, but we can also have post-incrementation, and in that case we would put the operator plus plus at the end. Here it is important to note that in this specific case, what happens if we want to assign this value to x is that first of all, it would take x equals number, so it would be 5, and then it will run the increment, but x will still remain 5 because we already have assigned number to it. This is why when you want to assign a value to a variable using incrementation, it is always good to use pre-incrementation, because otherwise you would use the old value, not the incremented value. However, for this incrementer, there is another use that we will see in other videos, which is the for loop. Because in a for loop, we always have to increment this counter. We'll talk about for loops in detail in about 2 videos from now. So until now, I just wanted to show you that in this case we have this I++, which is always post incremented. But when you want to assign to a variable using incrementation, you should do most probably pre-incrementation. Another important thing to note here is that we could have also int x equals minus minus number. So very similar to the incrementation, of course, this is decrementation, so decrementing. And this is also very important. In this case, we could use a console write line x, and it should display the number 4. And in fact, this happened. Once again, if we move the decrementation, so this is a pre-decrementation, if we make a post-decrementation, I would expect that we still see here in the console number 5. Let's see if this is the case. And indeed we get number 5, so not the decremented number, which should be 4. It's important to note that we have this unary operator, which is increment or decrement, that you can use before a variable name or after a variable name. Another unary operator that we use very often, especially in evaluating conditional statements, is the logical negation. And this is very simple. Let's define a bool. Let's name it is true, and let's set it to true. So let's make bool something, and then we used this here. So this exclamation mark before the is true boolean variable is basically a logical negation. So if this variable called is true is set to true, then when we negate it, it would be then false. And of course, if we would want to write something to the console, it would write false. So let's try this out, something, and let's run the console application. And in fact, we have false. And very similarly, if we initially set this to false, when we negate it with this exclamation mark, it will make it true. So right now our program should use true. And indeed it displayed true. That is correct, what we have expected. Also, this logical negation is an operator that we will use very, very often, especially in evaluating condition statements. So it's very important to note this logical negation. Let's here now delete everything that we have written so far, and let's go to another very important type of operators that we will use very often, and these are mathematical operators. Like, for instance, we declare a variable int x equals 5. Let's also declare another variable. Here I have a typo. Okay. Let's declare int y equal, let's say 10. In this case, we would have also an integer, so a variable of type integer called z, and this should be equal to x plus y. And of course, if we now want to print z to the console, it should display the sum. Let's do it. Let's try this out. And in fact, we have 15. The mathematical operators are exactly the ones that you know exactly also from school. So you can use exactly what you already know. We could, for instance, also try to do int w. Let's make it equal y, and we divide it by x. And in this case, if we print out w, it should do exactly what we expect. So it should divide 10 by 5. So if my math is not wrong, it should be 2 as a result in our console. And indeed, it is the case. Of course, we could do also multiplication and addition and subtraction and so on. But there is another very important operation that we will use fairly often, I would say, and this is the remainder or modulo operator. Let's also declare a new variable. Let's call it k, and k should be, let's make it once again y, but in this case we use this % symbol and x. And what this would do right now, it would basically also do a division. So it will divide 10 by 5, so y by x. But what we will have in the result is not the result of the division, but the remainder. So let's add k here, and since we can divide 10 by 5 without the need to have any reminder, the result that we should see in the console right now should be 0. But for instance, if we change here in this case our y to be 11, now the result should be the remainder of the division 11 divided by 5, which is of course 1. And this is correct. This operator, this remainder operator or modulo operator, is very important because this is one way in which we can define, for instance, if a number is even or odd. Because we know if we do this operation, and we divide a variable by 2 or a number by 2, if the remainder will be 0, it means that that number is even. But if the remainder would be 1, then of course that number is odd. So this remainder operator is really very, very important. Another thing to note here is that this type of operators follow all the rules that we know from the math classes in school. For instance, if we have here k should be equal to, let's say, 5 minus 2 and times 3. As we know, the way this would work, it will first perform the multiplication, which would be 2 times 3, that would be 6, and then it would do the subtraction, which would be 5 minus 6. So the end result should in this case be minus 1. It's important to note here and to know exactly that this type of mathematical operators follow the exact rules that you already learned in school. So it's nothing new that you have to learn. You maybe just have only to dig up a little bit what you have studied earlier in your life. Another category of operators are the so-called relational operators. And let's also delete here everything and let's put relational operators. And these operators usually check two different operands, if one is bigger than the other, if one is equal to the other, and so on. So in relational operators, let's define, for instance, int x equals 7. Let's define and initialize int y equals 14 or 19. Okay, and I forgot a space here. I will make this correct in just a few seconds. Let's also make a bool is greater, and let's make here, for instance, x is greater than y. So that's it. And let's write to the console is greater. Let's see what happens right now and what we'll have on the console. You see that it is false. So basically what we have done here, we have used a relational operator. And this means that we will always have an outcome that would be true or false in this case. So either x is bigger than y or x is smaller than y. Or of course they could be also equal. The idea is that this type of operators are also not new to you. We could also, for instance, use another bool is smaller, and in this case let's make it to be true. So let's make x is smaller than y. In this case, if we print to the console is smaller, it should be true in this case. Let's do it. As we can see, it is true in this case. Of course, what we could add here also as relational operator is that if they are greater or equal than, or less or equal than something else. In that case, let's also make this x be 19, and let's make here x is greater than or equal to y, or x is smaller than or equal to y. In that case, let's also print to the console is smaller, but also console.writeLine, and let's print here this is greater. That's it. Let's run this application. Okay, I have a typo here, of course, it's WriteLine. This should work right now, so let's run this program and see exactly what we will have on the console. So we'll have both time, so we will have 2 times true. The reason is, of course, because these numbers are equal. So if we evaluate this, if x is greater than or equal y, it's true because they are the same. And even if we say x is smaller than or equal to y, then of course this is also true because they are really the same numbers. And here, since we talk about these relational operators, a special kind of such type of relational operators are the equality operators. So when we want to check for exact match, for exact equality, in that case we could do also bool equals, or let's make it r equal. In this case, let's make x equals y. Now here we have to see this type of different two operators. This first equal sign is just an assignment operator, so we assign a value to a variable. But when we want to check for equality, we have to make equal equal. We have to write it this way, because otherwise the compiler will try to do an assignment, and this might probably break, or at least we would not get the expected result. Let's also here print a console write line. And r equal. In this case, we should see in the console 3 times true, which is correct. Let's now just change one of the numbers. Let's change x. Let's make it once again 7. In that case, we would have most probably 1 time true and 2 times false. Yes, we have false and false. But if we talk about these equality operators, we have used this equal equal operator, which checks for equality. But there is also a reverse. And if we make, or if we write down here exclamation mark and equal, this is another operator, and this means is not equal. And in that case, this Boolean variable should be true. If we run this program once again, we should have true, false, true, which is correct, exactly what we would have expected. Once again, it's very important when we think about equality operators, or when we want to check for equality, we always have to write equal equal. And if we want to check for inequality, we have to write exclamation mark and equal. If we only write equal, it will simply try to assign a value, and this is not what we really want to achieve. And this type of equality operators are very often used in if statements. And with this we can make we can go to the next category, which is also very often used in if statements, and these are the so-called conditional operators. And let's write here conditional operators. They are very simple. Conditional operators are logical operators. So what we would have here is and or or. So logical and or logical or. Let's assume that we have bool x. It is true. Let's also declare a bool variable, and we call it y, and let's make it to false. Let's make another bool. Let's call it k, and this should be true once again. Now here let's do another thing and make a last variable, which would be bool a and equal. And in this case, let's make, for instance, x and y. This would basically perform a logical operation. And this means that in order to return true, both x and y should be true. Now in this case, we see that x is true and y is false. I would expect in that case that if we print to the console, and let's remove these numbers here, let's also remove some space here to make everything fit better, and let's simply here write or print to the console this variable a. And let's see it in action. This is of course false, because again this is a logical operation, so x and y, this means that only if both are true we will have the result of true. If we use two pipes instead. So we don't use this double AND sign, we just use a double pipe sign, which is the logical OR operator. It will make the logical operation between X and Y. So X or Y. And logically, this would give true if one of the operands are true. In this case, we have X is true and Y is false. So when we run this program once again, I would expect to see true right now. And in fact, it is the case. So this is the difference between this logical AND and logical OR. Once again, for logical AND, you would have to use a double AND sign or character, and for the logical OR, you would have to use a double pipe. Let's also try a last experiment regarding this type of conditional operators. Let's, for instance, make X to be false. In this exact case, this A variable right now should also have false as a result, because we say X or Y, but both are false, none of them are true. In that case, the result should be false. So let's run this once again, and indeed we have here false, which is correct, exactly what we have expected. So there is no bug here. Once again, it is important really to know these operators. These are only a few of all the available operators that we have in C#, but these are really the ones that we will use very, very often in our programs, even now in our beginning stage of our software development career. So it's important to play around with them. Just invest 30 minutes, 1 hour besides watching this video, and play around with all the operators that we have seen in this video. Try to do mathematical operations. You can also use parentheses in there, just like in a real math class. Play around with these conditional operators, play around with the unary operators, and so on, because they are really, really important. They are one of the basics building blocks of being a C# or a .NET developer. In the next lesson, we will go one step further and we will finally start to add some logic to our application, and we will do condition statements. We'll look exactly into if, else, and the switch statements, how they work, how they are implemented, and how can we use them to really add some important logic to the application. And since we will be at that point where we want to add some logic, we will also see how we can get variables from the console. So how can we make a user input a certain variable, and how can we use it then further in our program that will also have a little bit of logic in it. So thank you very much for watching this lesson, and I hope to see you around in the next lesson.